Juliette pushed open the heavy wooden door, her heart pounding as she stepped inside. The office was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of expensive cologne and leather. She blinked, realizing too late that she had made a horrible mistake. A man sat behind a massive mahogany desk, his piercing blue eyes locking onto hers with sharp intensity. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his tailored suit molded to his powerful frame. He exuded authority, the kind that made people listen when he spoke. Juliette's stomach twisted. "Oh no," she whispered. The man slowly stood, his gaze never leaving her. "Who are you?" His voice was deep, smooth, and dangerously calm. "I was looking for the HR office," she stammered, gripping the folder in her hands like a lifeline. "I must have taken a wrong turn." His lips pressed together as he studied her. Clearly. Heat rushed to her face. She had only started at Ashford Enterprises 2 days ago, and now she had barged into what was obviously the CEO's office. The CEO. The man in front of her was Valentin Ashford, the elusive billionaire behind one of the world's most powerful corporations. "I am so sorry," Juliette blurted, stepping back toward the door. "I'll just..." "Wait." His voice halted her retreat. She swallowed hard as he rounded the desk, walking toward her with slow, measured steps. "You're new," he stated, eyes narrowing slightly. Juliette nodded, feeling impossibly small in his presence. "Yes, sir." A flicker of something crossed his face, amusement, perhaps. It was gone before she could decipher it. Valentin Ashford was known for being ruthless, a man who didn't waste time on pleasantries. "What department?" he asked. "Marketing." He leaned against his desk, arms folding across his chest. "And yet you ended up in my office instead." Juliette's cheeks burned. It was an honest mistake. His silence stretched between them, thick with something she couldn't name. Then, to her utter shock, the corner of his mouth lifted. "I suppose I can let it slide this once." Relief flooded her, but she didn't miss the way his eyes lingered on her as she turned to leave. She had no idea that, from that moment on, her life would never be the same. The next time Juliette saw Valentin was at a company gala. Dressed in an elegant midnight blue gown borrowed from her best friend, she felt completely out of place among the wealthy elite swirling around her. She had barely stepped inside when her breath hitched. Valentin stood across the room, impossibly handsome in a black tuxedo, a glass of whiskey in his hand. As if sensing her gaze, he turned. Their eyes met, and in an instant the noise of the party faded. Then, to her horror, he started walking toward her. "Miss Laurent," he greeted, his voice smooth as silk. Juliette's pulse pounded. "Mr. Ashford." He glanced at her dress, something unreadable flickering in his gaze. "You clean up well." She let out a nervous laugh. "I'll take that as a compliment." "You should." He studied her for a moment, then extended his hand. "Dance with me." Juliette hesitated. "I." Was that a no? His brows lifted slightly, as if daring her to refuse. She swallowed hard and placed her hand in his. The moment their fingers touched, a jolt of awareness shot through her. Valentin led her onto the dance floor with effortless grace, pulling her close as the orchestra played a slow, haunting melody. Juliette's heart raced as his hand settled on her waist. He smelled like expensive cologne and something distinctly masculine. "You intrigue me," he murmured. She glanced up at him, startled. "I do." His grip on her tightened slightly. "I don't say things I don't mean." Her breath caught. This was dangerous territory. Valentin Ashford was untouchable, a man surrounded by power and wealth far beyond her world. And yet, as he held her close, she couldn't deny the way her body responded to him. "Juliette," his voice was softer now, his lips near her ear. "I don't believe in coincidences. You walked into my office that day for a reason." She shivered. It was a mistake. Was it? Their eyes met, and for a brief, electrifying moment, nothing else existed. Juliette didn't know what terrified her more, the way his gaze burned into her, or the way she never wanted him to stop looking at her like that. The dance had ended, but the memory of Valentin's touch lingered on Juliette's skin long after she'd stepped away from the ballroom floor. She could still feel the warmth of his hand against her waist, the weight of his gaze that made it impossible to think clearly. She needed air. Navigating through the glittering crowd, she slipped onto the balcony, grateful for the cool breeze that brushed against her flushed skin. The city stretched out before her, lights shimmering like fallen stars across the skyline. She exhaled, pressing her palms against the stone railing, willing her pulse to steady. She couldn't allow herself to be swept into something reckless. Valentin Ashford was powerful, enigmatic, and completely out of her reach. Running away already? The deep voice made her stiffen. She turned, her breath catching as she found him standing at the threshold of the balcony, hands in his pockets. The ambient light illuminated the strong angles of his face, casting shadows that only made him more unreadable. "I just needed a moment," she admitted, not bothering to deny it. His eyes flickered over her, unreadable as he stepped closer. "Do I unsettle you?" The question sent a sharp thrill through her. She straightened, meeting his gaze with more resolve than she felt. "You're my boss." His lips parted slightly, as if he found the answer amusing. "That's not what I asked." A charged silence stretched between them. Every instinct told her to retreat, to put distance between herself and the dangerous pull of this man. But she remained rooted in place, drawn to something she didn't yet understand. "I don't play games, Juliette." The way he said her name was almost intimate, as if he were testing how it felt on his tongue. "I don't either," she countered. He considered her for a moment before exhaling, turning his gaze toward the city. "Good." Something in his voice softened, the intensity ebbing just enough for her to breathe again. "If you don't play games," she found herself asking, "then why did you dance with me?" His head tilted slightly, like he was debating how much to tell her. Then he turned those piercing eyes back on her. "Because I wanted to." Her heart gave a treacherous lurch. She wasn't sure what she'd expected, but honesty wasn't it. She searched his face, trying to decipher the enigma that was Valentin Ashford. He was known for his ruthless business acumen, for being a man who never revealed his thoughts unless it served him. And yet, here he was, standing inches away, offering nothing but unfiltered truth. A dangerous truth. "I should go back inside," she murmured. He didn't move to stop her, but his gaze followed her as she stepped past him, his presence lingering in the air long after she had disappeared into the crowd. Over the next few days, Juliette told herself that the encounter on the balcony had been a momentary lapse of judgment. She buried herself in her work, avoiding unnecessary interactions that might bring her anywhere near Valentin. But avoiding a man like him was impossible. Late one evening, when most of the office had emptied, she remained at her desk, tapping away at her keyboard when a shadow fell over her workspace. She looked up, pulse spiking. Valentin stood there, his expression unreadable. "You're still here," he noted. She straightened. "I had some things to finish." He glanced at her screen, then back at her, and no one else was available to do them. She frowned. "I don't mind the extra work." His gaze sharpened slightly, as if assessing her. Is that dedication or avoidance? She stiffened. "Excuse me." He leaned against the edge of her desk, far too close for her heart's comfort. "You've been avoiding me." Her throat tightened. "That's not true." His brow lifted slightly, and for a moment she thought he might press the issue. But instead, he simply studied her, as if debating something internally. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek, black envelope. He set it on her desk. "What is this?" she asked warily. "An invitation." She hesitated before picking it up, opening it to reveal an elegant, embossed card. A charity gala, a high-profile event. Her eyes snapped back to his. "Why are you giving this to me?" "Because I want you there," he said simply. Her pulse stuttered. "Mr. Ashford, I'm not." "Valentin," he interrupted smoothly. She swallowed hard. "I don't belong at events like this." His expression remained impassive, but something flickered in his gaze. "You let me decide that." Her grip tightened on the envelope. This was a terrible idea. But as she looked at the man in front of her, she realized something dangerous. She wasn't sure she wanted to say no. Juliette stood in front of the grand estate, her fingers tightening around the invitation as the towering gates opened before her. This was madness. She shouldn't be here. But the moment Valentin had handed her that envelope, a part of her had known she would come. The gala was nothing short of breathtaking. Crystal chandeliers dripped from cathedral-high ceilings, casting golden light over a sea of impeccably dressed guests. Waiters in pristine white jackets moved through the crowd, balancing trays of champagne and hors d'oeuvres. The air hummed with the sound of refined laughter and soft orchestral music. Juliette hesitated at the entrance, feeling like an outsider in her borrowed gown. She had spent hours convincing herself that she didn't belong here, but the moment she stepped inside, she felt something even more unsettling: the weight of eyes on her. And then, as if drawn by an invisible thread, she turned. Valentin stood near the grand staircase, his gaze locked onto hers. He was dressed in a devastatingly tailored black tuxedo, the sharp lines emphasizing every inch of his commanding presence. A quiet intensity burned in his expression, as though he had been waiting for this exact moment. The space between them seemed to shrink as he crossed the room, his movements deliberate. When he reached her, he extended a hand, wordlessly offering her an escape from the scrutiny of the crowd. As she took it, he led her through the opulent ballroom, past murmured conversations and stolen glances. He didn't stop until they reached a secluded alcove just beyond the glow of the chandeliers. "You came," he said, his voice lower than usual. "You gave me little choice," she replied, attempting to inject some levity into the moment, but her pulse betrayed her, hammering in her chest. His lips curved slightly, not quite a smile, but something close. "You always have a choice, Juliette." The way he said her name sent a shiver down her spine. She glanced around, desperate for something to focus on other than the way his presence consumed the air between them. "This is extravagant." "It's necessary," he corrected. "Every person in this room serves a purpose." "And what purpose do I serve?" she asked before she could stop herself. A flicker of something dark passed through his eyes. "That," he murmured, "is what I intend to find out." Her breath caught. Before she could respond, a couple approached them, their laughter grating against the quiet tension that had settled between her and Valentin. "Valentin," the man greeted, his tone warm but carrying an unmistakable undercurrent of calculation. "And who is this?" Juliette felt a strange pressure settle on her shoulders as the couple's gaze swept over her, assessing. She was keenly aware of how out of place she must seem, standing beside a man like Valentin Ashford. Valentin didn't hesitate. "Juliette Laurent," he introduced, his voice leaving no room for question. "A valued part of my company." Something about the way he said it made her stomach tighten. The woman's eyes twinkled with curiosity. "A pleasure, Juliette. You must be quite exceptional if you've caught Valentin's attention." Juliette forced a polite smile, though she had no idea how to respond to that. Valentin's grip on her hand tightened slightly, as if sensing her discomfort. "If you'll excuse us," he said smoothly, steering Juliette away before another word could be exchanged. Once they were alone again, she exhaled. That was intense. A shadow of amusement flickered across his face. You'll get used to it. She shook her head. I don't think I will. He studied her for a long moment, then surprised her by saying, Come with me. Before she could question him, he was already leading her away from the crowd, down a hall lined with towering windows that overlooked the sprawling gardens. The further they moved from the ballroom, the quieter the world became, until it was just the two of them and the faint rustle of the wind outside. Finally, he stopped, turning to face her fully. Do you know why I invited you tonight? He asked. She swallowed, her throat dry. To confuse me. A low exhale, almost a laugh. No, his expression grew more serious. Because I wanted to see how you would handle this world. Her brows furrowed, and his gaze drifted over her, considering. You're stronger than you think. The words sent something warm curling in her chest. She looked away, suddenly overwhelmed. Valentin, don't. Don't what? Understand what this is. Silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, he reached out, his fingers brushing against hers. Neither do I, he admitted. And for the first time, she saw something raw in his gaze, something that made it impossible to look away. Juliette's breath hitched as Valentin's fingers brushed against hers, the simple touch igniting something undeniable between them. Neither of them moved, caught in the charged silence that hung in the air like an unspoken confession. For a man who commanded every room he entered, who wielded power with effortless precision, Valentin seemed almost hesitant now. It was that hesitation, the rare vulnerability in his expression, that made Juliette's heart hammer against her ribs. She should have stepped away. She should have reminded herself that she was just an employee, that this world of glittering chandeliers and hushed conversations wasn't meant for her. But instead, she found herself speaking, her voice barely above a whisper. What are we doing, Valentin? His jaw tightened slightly, his gaze never leaving hers. Something I can't seem to stop. The honesty in his words sent a shiver through her. Then, without another word, he lifted her hand, pressing a slow, deliberate kiss to the back of her fingers. The heat of his lips against her skin was fleeting, but it sent a shockwave through her entire body. She exhaled sharply, her pulse unsteady. I don't bring people into my life easily, he murmured, his voice low, intimate. But you walked into my office that day and changed everything. Juliette's heart clenched. She wanted to believe him, but the weight of his world, the sheer magnitude of who he was, felt impossible to contend with. This doesn't make sense, she admitted. Maybe not, he said, his thumb tracing over her knuckles. But tell me you don't feel it. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Lying would be pointless. The way her body reacted to him, the way her thoughts had been consumed by him since that first day, it was undeniable. Valentin took a slow step closer, his presence overwhelming. I want to do this right, Juliette. No hiding, no pretending. Her throat tightened. And what exactly is this? His lips parted slightly, as though he was about to say something profound, something that would change everything. But before he could, the distant sound of approaching footsteps shattered the moment. Juliette instinctively pulled her hand away, stepping back just as a suited man rounded the corner. He barely spared her a glance before addressing Valentin. Mr. Ashford, your presence is needed. There's a situation with the investors. Valentin's expression hardened, the warmth from mere moments ago replaced with the sharp edge of a man who is always in control. I'll be there shortly, he said, his voice clipped. The man nodded and disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. Juliette exhaled, forcing herself to regain composure. You should go. Valentin's gaze lingered on her, unreadable. This conversation isn't over." Then, with one last lingering look, he turned and walked away, leaving Juliette standing alone, her hand still tingling where he had touched her. Days passed, and though Juliette told herself she would keep her distance, fate had other plans. She had just finished gathering her things for the evening when her phone buzzed a message from an unknown number. "Come outside." Her heart pounded as she stared at the text. There was no name, but she didn't need one. She knew exactly who it was. Against her better judgment, she slipped out of the building, stepping onto the quiet street. A sleek black car idled at the curb, and the moment she appeared, the back door opened. Valentin was inside, waiting. For a moment she hesitated. This was reckless, this was dangerous. But then she met his gaze, and all logic unraveled. She slid into the car, the door clicking shut behind her. There was no small talk, no hesitation. Valentin reached for her hand, his grip firm, grounding. "I had to see you," he admitted. Her breath caught. "Why?" He exhaled, his thumb brushing over her palm. "Because every time, close my eyes, you're there." The confession sent a wave of warmth through her. She didn't fight it this time, didn't overthink or second-guess. Instead, she leaned in, letting the weight of everything between them pull her under. Juliette sat in the quiet luxury of Valentin's car, the hum of the city beyond the tinted windows a distant murmur. His hand remained over hers, his grip firm, yet unspoken questions lingered in the space between them. He had sought her out despite every logical reason not to, and she had come to him despite knowing better. Breaking the silence, Valentin's voice was low, steady. "Come with me." She turned her head to meet his gaze. "Where?" His thumb traced over the back of her hand, an absent motion that sent shivers up her arm. "Somewhere we won't be interrupted." Juliette hesitated. The world he belonged to was filled with expectations, scrutiny, and consequences she wasn't sure she was ready for. But beneath all of that, there was something else, something raw and real that neither of them could seem to fight. Instead of answering, she nodded. The car pulled away from the curb, the city lights blurring as they wove through the streets. Juliette didn't ask where they were going, and Valentin didn't offer an explanation. Minutes later, they arrived at a towering building, its sleek glass exterior reflecting the night sky. The driver opened her door, but before she could step out, Valentin was there, offering his hand. She took it, letting him guide her inside. The elevator ride was silent, though the air between them was anything but. She felt the weight of his presence beside her, the quiet intensity with which he watched her reflection in the polished steel doors. When they reached the penthouse, the doors slid open to reveal a space unlike anything she had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the glittering skyline, and the open layout was designed with sophistication minimalist, yet undeniably luxurious. She stepped inside, taking in the understated elegance, the dark marble floors, the sleek furniture, the soft glow of ambient lighting. It was a world away from her reality. Valentin came to stand beside her. "I don't bring many people here." She glanced at him, sensing the unspoken meaning behind his words. "Why me?" His expression was unreadable for a moment, then he exhaled slowly. "Because haven't been able to stop thinking about you since the moment you walked into my office." Her heart thudded painfully against her ribs. She turned away, walking toward the windows, pressing her palms against the cool glass. Below them, the city stretched endlessly, alive with energy. "This is impossible," she whispered. Valentin moved behind her, his presence a solid warmth at her back. "Why?" She squeezed her eyes shut, willing herself to think clearly. "Because you have a world built around you, a life that doesn't have space for." "For what?" His voice was softer now, his breath warm against her shoulder. "For someone like me." A beat of silence. Then, gently, he turned her to face him. "You think I care about that?" She lifted her gaze to his, searching for any hint of hesitation. But there was none, only certainty. "You should," she murmured. His fingers brushed against her cheek, tilting her chin up. "Maybe I should, but I don't." Her breath hitched. "I built this world, Juliette," he continued, "and if I want you in it, I'll make space." She wanted to believe him, wanted to let herself fall completely into the gravitational pull of him. But fear was a stubborn thing. "I don't want to be something you chase for a moment and then leave behind when reality catches up," she admitted, her voice barely audible. Something flickered in his gaze, something that looked dangerously close to frustration. "You think this is temporary?" he asked, his voice rougher now, more raw. She swallowed hard. "Isn't it?" Without warning, Valentin took her hand and pressed it against his chest. Underneath the fabric of his shirt, his heartbeat was strong, steady. "This isn't fleeting," he said, his voice thick with conviction. "This isn't something I'll forget in the morning." She felt herself unraveling, piece by piece. And then, just as easily as he had drawn her in, he released her, stepping back. "I'll prove it to you," he said simply. Juliette stared at him, her pulse unsteady. She didn't know what terrified her more, the possibility that he meant it, or the possibility that she might let herself believe it. Juliette had never known a man like Valentin Ashford before, one who didn't hesitate, who pursued with unwavering certainty. And true to his word, he wasted no time proving it to her. The following morning, her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. She hesitated before opening it. "Be ready at 8. That was it, no name, no explanation, but she knew exactly who it was. And despite every warning in her head, she was ready when the clock struck 8. A sleek black car pulled up outside her apartment. The driver stepped out, holding the door open for her. She hesitated, gripping her coat a little tighter, before finally sliding inside. Valentin was waiting. He was dressed in a dark navy coat over a crisp white dress shirt, his presence commanding even in the intimate space of the car. But there was something different about him, tonight, something softer in the way he looked at her. "Where are we going?" she asked, watching him carefully. His lips quirked at the corners. "Somewhere I can keep my promise." She wanted to ask what that meant, but the way he was watching her, like he already knew she was going to let him take her wherever he wanted, made her heart stutter. The car wove through the city streets before pulling up to a private rooftop restaurant, the kind that didn't take reservations from just anyone. Juliette's breath caught as they stepped out. The terrace was lined with glowing lanterns, casting a golden light over the intimate space. A single table was set near the edge, overlooking the city skyline. She turned to him, her voice barely above a whisper. "You did all this." His gaze never wavered. "Told you, Juliette, I don't do things halfway." A waiter appeared, holding out a chair for her. She sat slowly, still trying to process the effort behind all of this. Valentin took his seat across from her, watching her reaction carefully. "You don't have to do this," she said, her fingers brushing over the edge of the linen napkin. "I want to," he countered. A beat of silence passed between them before she finally asked, "Why?" His fingers tapped against the stem of his wine glass. "Because for the first time in a long time, I don't want to be anywhere else." Her heart stuttered. Juliette had spent her whole life knowing what it was like to be overlooked, to be seen as temporary. But there was nothing temporary about the way Valentin was looking at her. Dinner passed in a blur of easy conversation and stolen glances. He listened when she spoke, asked the kind of questions that made her feel like he genuinely wanted to know every part of her. And when the plates were cleared and the wine was nearly gone, he did something that made her breath catch entirely. He reached across the table, his fingers brushing against hers. "I know you're afraid," he murmured. She swallowed hard. "I know this seems impossible, that I seem impossible." His hand was warm against hers, "but I don't make promises, don't intend to keep." She should have pulled away, should have told him that this was too much, too soon. But instead, she whispered, "And what exactly are you promising?" His thumb brushed against her wrist, his touch sending a slow, steady warmth through her. "That I'm not going anywhere." And for the first time since she'd met him, Juliette let herself believe it. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. Valentin didn't just make space for her in his life, he wove her into it seamlessly, as if she had always belonged there. He showed up outside her office with coffee when she worked late. He took her to places she had only ever dreamed of seeing. And most dangerously of all, he made her laugh. But it wasn't just the grand gestures that undid her. It was the quiet moments, too. The way he listened when she spoke, the way he reached for her hand without thinking, as if touching her had become second nature. She was falling. And she was falling fast. So when he invited her to an exclusive charity gala, a night where the most powerful figures in the city would be watching, she knew exactly what it meant. It wasn't just an event, it was a statement. He wasn't hiding her. He was claiming her. That night, as she stepped into the grand ballroom, dressed in a gown he had sent for her without asking, she felt the weight of every pair of eyes on them. But none of them mattered. Because the moment Valentin's hand found hers, the rest of the world faded. He leaned in, his voice just for her. "Are you ready?" She squeezed his fingers. "I think I've been waiting for this from the moment I walked into your office." His gaze darkened, something unreadable flashing in his eyes. "Then let's give them something to talk about." And with that, he kissed her. Right there in the middle of the ballroom, in front of everyone. It wasn't just a kiss. It was a declaration. And Juliette knew, without a doubt, that she belonged right where she was. With him. Always.